Ethiopia now, the country earned about $3.6 billion from exports in the just concluded fiscal year, a record high in the country's history. According to authorities, Ethiopia's external earnings rose 20%, with agricultural products such as coffee and flowers driving that growth. With the details, here is CGTN's Groom Chala from Addis Ababa.
According to reports from the Ethiopian Ministry of Trade, the country had planned to earn $4.1 billion from export trade and achieved an 88% return as it ranked in $3.62 billion. Agriculture, mining and industry sectors were the key performers during the period which ended in June.
This year, we have registered the highest export trade success. This is also the highest value we have ever recorded in the sector. 88% of our goal has been achieved. Compared to last year, it's a growth of 19.5%.
For decades, Ethiopia was seen as a market that followed global rules written elsewhere. That assumption no longer holds. Without confrontation, Ethiopia began building alternative trade paths, financial links, and logistics networks step by step. What changed was not one deal, but the system itself. Today, supply chains are shifting, Western firms are recalculating, and Washington is asking how this happens so fast. This is the story of how a nation rewired its place in global trade without asking permission and why the consequences are only beginning to surface.
Ethiopia's shift did not arrive with a headline-grabbing announcement or a dramatic diplomatic standoff. It unfolded quietly through ports, rail corridors, customs agreements, and trade signatures that most global audiences barely noticed at the time. Yet taken together, these moves amount to something far larger than routine economic policy. Ethiopia has systematically repositioned itself at the center of emerging global trade flows, reducing its reliance on Western-dominated systems and reshaping how goods, capital, and influence move across one of the world's most strategic regions. By the time Washington began to recognize the scale of the change, much of the groundwork had already been laid. For decades, Ethiopia was viewed primarily through the lens of development aid, humanitarian assistance, and security cooperation. Its economy was often described as promising but constrained, heavily dependent on external financing, preferential trade access, and Western-controlled logistics routes. That perception now looks increasingly outdated. Over the past several years, Ethiopia has pursued a deliberate strategy to diversify its trade relationships, logistics infrastructure, and financial partnerships in ways that fundamentally alter its position in the global economy. At the core of this transformation is trade diversification. Ethiopia has expanded commercial ties well beyond traditional Western markets, deepening economic relationships across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and other parts of Africa. Manufacturing exports, agricultural goods, and industrial inputs are increasingly directed toward partners that offer long-term infrastructure investment, fewer political conditions, and faster market access. These relationships are not symbolic. They are structured around concrete supply contracts, industrial park investments, and logistics agreements that lock in trade flows for years rather than months. Logistics has been another critical pillar. Ethiopia's geographic reality as a landlocked country once limited its economic reach and made it vulnerable to external pressure. Instead of accepting this constraint, Addis Ababa treated it as a strategic challenge to be solved. By investing heavily in rail links, road networks, and cross-border trade corridors, Ethiopia effectively rewired how it connects to global markets. Modern rail infrastructure linking the country to major ports has reduced shipping times and costs, making Ethiopian exports more competitive and less dependent on traditional Western shipping routes and insurance systems. Port access agreements across the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden have further reduced vulnerability. Rather than relying on a single gateway, Ethiopia has diversified its maritime access, ensuring that no single political dispute or policy shift can choke off its trade. This logistical flexibility has quietly shifted leverage away from Western actors who once exercised outsized influence through financing, sanctions risk, or regulatory pressure. Financial architecture has also evolved. Ethiopia has increasingly relied on alternative financing mechanisms for infrastructure and industrial expansion, reducing exposure to Western-dominated financial institutions. Trade settlements in non-Western currencies, regional banking partnerships, and development financing from emerging economies have given Ethiopian policymakers more room to maneuver. These choices do not represent rejection of Western systems, but rather insulation from overdependence on them. This shift caught Washington off guard for a simple reason. It unfolded gradually and without confrontation. There was no single moment that demanded immediate response. Instead, signals appeared in fragmented data points. New trade agreements here, a rail line there, industrial parks filled with non-Western manufacturers, and export figures that no longer followed familiar patterns. For Western companies accustomed to seeing Ethiopia as an aid-dependent market or a low-cost manufacturing extension of Western supply chains, the change was easy to underestimate. By the time the implications became clearer, influence had already begun to slip. Western firms found themselves competing on less favorable terms, no longer enjoying the informal advantages that came with political alignment, preferential financing, or regulatory familiarity. Supply chains quietly shifted. Contracts were awarded to partners willing to invest long-term rather than seek short-term margins. Standards and compliance frameworks increasingly reflected non-Western models, forcing Western companies to adapt rather than dictate. The economic consequences are not theoretical. As Ethiopia becomes a more central manufacturing and logistics hub, decisions made in Addis Ababa increasingly shape regional supply chains. Lost contracts, reduced market share, and weaker pricing power are real risks for United States and allied businesses that fail to adjust. For industries ranging from textiles and agribusiness to construction materials and light manufacturing, Ethiopia is no longer a peripheral market. It is becoming a gatekeeper. Ethiopia's strategic importance amplifies these effects. Situated in the Horn of Africa, it lies at the intersection of some of the world's most critical maritime routes, linking Africa to the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Its population size provides both a massive labor force and a growing consumer market. Its role in regional trade corridors connects landlocked neighbors to global markets, giving Ethiopia influence far beyond its borders. When Ethiopia adjusts its trade orientation, the ripple effects are felt across East Africa and beyond. Regionally, Ethiopia's move aligns with a broader African trend toward economic self-definition. Across the continent, governments are seeking greater control over trade terms, industrial policy, and infrastructure ownership. The expansion of intra-African trade, supported by continental frameworks and regional corridors, is reducing dependence on distant markets. Ethiopia's strategy fits squarely within this shift, but its scale and speed set it apart. South-South trade has been a major accelerant. Emerging economies increasingly trade directly with one another, bypassing traditional intermediaries. Ethiopia has positioned itself as a reliable partner within this network, offering manufacturing capacity, logistical connectivity, and political stability relative to regional peers. This has strengthened its bargaining power while diluting Western influence that once flowed through aid conditionality and market access incentives. The global context makes Ethiopia's repositioning even more consequential. Competition between major powers is no longer confined to military alliances or diplomatic forums. It plays out through ports, supply chains, standard setting, and infrastructure financing. Control over trade routes and production hubs increasingly defines geopolitical influence. Ethiopia's quiet recalibration signals that African states are not merely arenas for this competition, but active architects of its outcomes. For Washington, the challenge is not simply economic. It is strategic. Influence built over decades through development programs, preferential access, and corporate presence can erode quickly when alternative systems mature. Missed signals matter. Assumptions about alignment can become liabilities. Ethiopia's choices demonstrate that countries once viewed as dependent can, with patience and planning, redesign their position in the global system. Yet Ethiopia's strategy is not without risks. Diversification requires careful balancing to avoid new dependencies replacing old ones. Infrastructure investments must deliver long-term returns. Regional stability remains essential, but the direction is clear. Ethiopia is no longer waiting to be integrated into global trade on someone else's terms. It is actively shaping how that integration occurs. As supply chains continue to fragment and global power becomes more distributed, Ethiopia's experience may offer a blueprint for other emerging economies. The question now is not whether Washington noticed too late, but whether it can adapt to a world where influence must be earned through partnership rather than assumed through history. If Ethiopia's quiet rewiring continues, the map of global trade may look very different a decade from now, and the balance of geopolitical influence along with it.